Hey everyone, welcome to the live stream. Just going to let a few of you join now before I get into it, but going to break down some student responses, give you some essay feedback, do what we typically do, where we answer your questions for your assessments, how to get better at your essays or whatever component of the exams you need help with. How do you actually improve those? Let's break down some real examples and look at real student responses and go through actionable feedback that you can all apply to your own work. So here to help with anything exam related, anything English related, year 7 to 12, be it New South Wales, Victoria, any other state. Put your questions through in the chat if you have any questions that you'd like me to answer. And if you would like to be one of the students who gets their work broken down by me in one of these live streams, make sure you use the link below these YouTube videos when they're published. And via that link, you'll be able to submit your work, a paragraph of work that you want reviewed. You want to see how you could better respond to a question. You want to see how you could improve the way you're introducing your essay, a body paragraph, whatever it might be. Submit that using the link, and the form will give you everything you need. Otherwise, good to see at least a couple of you in here, or maybe one person at the moment. But I'm sure more will join, hopefully. Otherwise, you might be watching this later on. But in any case, let's jump into it. Let's get straight into some feedback for you. So I'm going to share the screen now, and we can go from there. There we go. So I'm going to break down this question. This is the first question we will look at. And I know a lot of you, if you're watching from New South Wales, going back to school, or Victoria, just went back to school last week. So might be a little bit rusty. Hopefully this can get you back into gear. No doubt you're going to have some assessments coming up shortly. So I'm going to look at a response here from Jake. He's got a response that is to a question based on the Tempest and Hagseed. That is for Module A, the textual conversation between the Tempest and Hagseed. The question is, the essay question that Jake's responding to is, how does Atwood's novel provide a layered commentary? A layered commentary. It's got layers. That makes me think metatextuality. It makes me think meta-theatre, meta-fiction. The Tempest, Shakespeare's play, is heavily meta-theatrical. So that meta-theatricality is something that Margaret Atwood, in her adapted novel, is going to preserve. She's going to preserve it in a metafictional way, in a metatextual way. She's actually going to embed the play itself. She's going to feature the play The Tempest within her novel. And that is for a couple of reasons that she would have that layering. But one is to actually commemorate, or at least preserve, that meta-theatrical element of Shakespeare's play. So because Shakespeare created a play that was very much about a play within a play, and it even featured plays within a play, but it also had the metaphorical performance by Prospero, who's essentially like a director of the island. And he uses his magic, just like a director uses their directorial choices to guide or govern what's going on the stage. So we've got a metaphorical performance taking place within the performance of The Tempest itself, and you've also got plays within the play, and you've got that kind of meta-theatrical element, which really draws our attention to the artificial nature of the dramatic vehicle. So if we're watching a play, we realize, hey, this is actually fictional, okay, but it's not that different to real life. Like, people are always putting on performances. So yes, it draws our attention to the dramatic artifice. That is to say, yes, what you're watching on the stage is not real, but it also blurs the distinction between illusion and reality, between performance and truth or authenticity. Because if you're watching a play like The Tempest and there's a performance going on within the performance, it reminds you that you are often yourself playing a character, that we play roles in society. Maybe you act differently around your friends than you act around your family. No doubt that probably is the case. You might even talk differently. The language you use changes. So we are constantly adapting our behavior and our identities to our surroundings. And if nothing else, The Tempest is a good reminder of that everyone is always putting on these performances, but that also gives you a level of control. It means, hey, you have to take control over how you are acting and choose to be the best identity that you can be and relinquish the identities that are actually predicated on control and an inability to let go of certain elements that aren't good for us. Like Prospero never wants to let go of his magic, his control. He never wants to let go of his desire for revenge. But in letting go of those things, it actually frees him up. So he lets go of certain identities in order to assume responsibility for other identities. So that was a very long-winded answer to the question of how does Margaret Atwood have this kind of layered commentary. But the simple answer is that much like the play is meta-theatrical, we go from meta-theater into meta-fiction, or you could call it, meta-textuality more generally. So that's having, the meta-theater is having a play within the play, performance within the performance, layers of performance in that play. And then Atwood is metafictional in the sense, or metatextual in the sense that she actually features a play within the novel. She has the play itself within the novel. And again, both of these draw our attention to the inherent performativity of life, that everyone is playing roles, okay? And that those roles can be, everyone plays a role, often multiple, and those roles / identities can be imprisoning or liberating, depending on which roles you choose to assume. So there's one kind of breakdown there if you're interested in those points. The other part of the question, it says, how does Atwood's novel provide a layered commentary on Shakespeare's play through adaptation and appropriation? It's interesting that he uses the word appropriation. I would take that very loosely because appropriation is a very specific type of adaptation, if you will. It's not really even an adaptation. You can appropriate something, use it for your own political or social purposes without it being a direct adaptation. But the novel itself literally says this is an adaptation. It's an adaptation of The Tempest, but it has appropriated elements for political or social purposes. So the appropriation part is mostly linked to the purpose of Atwood, that she actually has this social agenda when she talks about reform, prison reform, for instance, that's going on in Canada. Margaret Atwood is a progressive feminist, and she would be pushing for these social reforms. So she's going to use The Tempest as a platform because of its universality. Everyone knows Shakespeare. She's going to use it and adapt it and say, hey, we're going from Shakespeare to a more progressive society and a more progressive take in Hagseed. And she kind of weaves in, quite explicitly at times, her own social agenda for change, for reform. So the fact that it's got social reform in there is the appropriation part. And the adaptation, of course, is how she adapts the characters, how Prospero becomes Felix, how many of the other characters morph into or are represented by multiple other characters. So, Prospero, Felix being an obvious one. But Miranda has a couple of different applications. We see, for instance, Caliban represented by all of the inmates, the collective of the inmates, a collective embodiment of Caliban, collective of inmates. So there are some really creative adaptations here. The Jeddle resource, of course, has a lot more breakdown of all these comparisons, but all of that is in there. So just be aware that the adaptation is more about the reimagining, the reframing of certain elements from the play into the novel. So you've got to talk about that. And then the appropriation is more about the social or political agenda, how certain elements have been appropriated for a certain purpose. So I would link that more to the purpose in terms of social political agenda, the progressive agenda of Atwood in particular. Otherwise, it really is more so an adaptation. The adaptation, of course, is adapted to appease or to speak to contemporary values. So the postmodern values, feminist values, progressive values, the movement away from a lot of the medieval values or feudalistic values of Shakespeare's time. That's what you want to talk about. Anything in Module A, when you talk about why something has been adapted, why have certain elements been adapted or appropriated the way they have, that links to contextual change in the values that the composer or composers are responding to. Okay, you need to speak to this shift in contextual values. That's going to be the separator. If you can be really specific here, so e.g., not just saying postmodern or contemporary values, but saying something about the progressivism, right? The progressive movement towards social or even specifically prison reform in Hagseed, right? Speaking to the movement in Canada, right? You might even say in Canada if we were using that in a sentence, right? Canadian prison reform. Then that kind of phrasing would allow you to be a lot more specific about the context and why certain elements have been adapted. So remember, you can talk about how something has been adapted, how there's a layered commentary in the sense that it's got that meta textuality, that it actually has this kind of pedagogical style because Felix is teaching the inmates about the play and about human nature, and then indirectly or vicariously teaching the audience and the reader about us. Felix teaching the inmates is basically Atwood reshaping our understanding of the Tempest, and that's key, right? So there's a layered commentary that actually educates us and transforms our understanding of the Tempest. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. Okay, so moving on from that, and I'm going to take these out, I think. Just checking the audio. Okay, just using this mic now. Sorry, just switching up the mic. So let's continue. I'm going to go through this response right now and have a read of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to score the response. Okay, we're going to have a look at why certain elements are in the band 6 range or an A range and why other elements are not. So let's break down those parts now. Okay, so here's the student response. As the newer text converses with the hypotext. Now, hypotext, I believe, should really be one word. Hypotext means the earlier text, hypo and hyper texts, right? So it's a good technical word that people use when they talk about adaptations or appropriations. So newer text, hypertext, converses with the hypotext that came before. It is able to reimagine and extend universal human concerns established by previous composers to a postmodern audience. Now, there's a few kind of potential issues with this first sentence. As an introductory sentence, first of all, it doesn't use the language of the question. See how it doesn't say the adapted text or the appropriated text? So try and use the language that best suits the question. Like you might have to alter what you were going to say in a draft or what you did say in your draft to better suit the question that you've actually been asked. So as the adapted text, it just hits the question straight away and it gives the marker no doubt that you are responding to the question. Okay, so that's the first thing to note. This can be quite minor. I was going to say subtle, but it's not subtle. The point is to be obvious. So we want to say adapted, adaptation. Great. But, and you could call it hypotext, but again, that's just like with an original text or an earlier text. Hypotext is fine. Just make sure you don't space it out, even though it's going to suggest that you do. So try and use the language of the keywords of the question as much as possible.
Okay, so just going back to this, I don't know if I've been exactly consistent here. So I think, what's that? Green, orange, yellow. But because I've used other color codes here, I'm actually going to stick with this. So any words of the question are going to be blue. Okay, as the adapted text converses with an earlier text or the hypertext, however you want to say that, it is able to reimagine and extend. So you've got reimagine and extend. So this is the double up problem. Now, it's not to say you can't say both of these words, but if you don't add some kind of cause and effect between them, it just sounds like you're using two slightly different words and bundling them together, and therefore just risk confusing the marker. What are you actually trying to say? It's able to reimagine and extend, or do you mean it's able to reimagine and therefore extend? I know it's a subtle thing, but if you can just add and therefore extend and or thereby and thus, it is able to reimagine and therefore extend universal human concerns, or appropriate, right? It is able to appropriate human concerns for a contextually dissonant audience. That's where we can go, because you haven't used appropriate here. So as the adapted text converses with a hypertext, it is able to, what about appropriate, prioritize the keywords of the question. It is able to appropriate. Then you say universal human concerns. I have an issue with that because it's so vague, but let's just say we keep that for this one. I would try and bring in like specific concerns that encapsulate the themes of the Tempest and Hagseed, even though we're not going to mention the text in this first sentence, which is a good idea. Introduce the module, the value of textual conversations generally. Even though it is not text specific, it should be drawing upon the key concerns of the text at the highest level. But just leaving it at universal concerns is a little bit vague. It risks kind of, I would say, disadvantaging yourself in the eyes of the marker because you're not showing a more nuanced understanding of the module. It's so generic. I understand why you've done it generic because you haven't brought in the text yet. But if you can still kind of draw upon the overall themes in a creative way, then that could elevate the quality here. So it is able to appropriate universal concerns, or like, see, instead of saying that, I'll show you. Like I would say it is able to appropriate the universal experience, or the universal kind of performativity. Like say the main thing is the performativity, because it doesn't actually, this question doesn't even provide a specific theme. So you get to take the reins there. And often you do with this particular module. So you'll find that a lot of the questions aren't theme specific. They might have extracts that allude to themes that you're meant to pick up on. But generally speaking, you have a lot of control over the themes that you want to introduce at the outset. So as the adapted text converses with a hypertext, it is able to appropriate the universal performativity of the human experience, right? It is able to appropriate the universal performativity. So the performativity word is an example of a term that is specific to the two texts, but I still don't need to mention the texts in this sentence. But it goes beyond just human concerns, okay? So you could say it is able to appropriate the universal performativity of the human experience for a postmodern audience. Well, it's only a postmodern audience if it is a postmodern audience. So the way it's framed here doesn't suggest that the later text or the adapted text is always for a postmodern audience. So that's my issue with the postmodern bit here, is it's not given that it is postmodern. Postmodern is a particular period of time, after World War II. So after 1945 up until around now is kind of a postmodern period. But that's only a specific period in time. That doesn't imply that any future text that is an adaptation is for a postmodern audience. So just be careful with the way that that's worded. This one is too specific, funnily enough, for this one. So it is able to appropriate the universal performativity of the human experience for contextually dissonant. See, I don't know that it's postmodern, but I know that it's a different context and they have dissonant values. So I'm using contextually dissonant because it comes from the module description. So we're always drawing upon the rubric wherever we can, ideally in a specific way. So it's able to appropriate the universal performativity of the human experience for a contextually dissonant audience. So an audience that comes from a different context. Great. So I would kind of replace that with that one. It has this text-specific word. Performativity is a great one. It's a really general word. It could have been like the universal struggle to escape one's socially prescribed identity, or the universal struggle to free oneself from certain identities or repressive identities or something like that. Depends what kind of angle you're taking on the study, of course. But having something that ties to the text will then help you better ease into the next sentence. So that's my feedback on the first one. In terms of the original one, that sentence was just a bit too vague for my liking, but I like the structure of it, that you've got this like high level module specific sentence as the first one. So a tick for the structure. The execution of it, though, could have been better by just being a little bit more specific and avoiding these more generic terms and avoiding the double ups. Or if you do a double up, make sure you say something like reimagine and therefore extend. So it's got that singular focus versus having these two different things that could be confusing. Okay, so on to the next one. So these notions, I don't like these notions are evidenced. It feels like this is a body paragraph, almost the way that's worded. These notions are evidenced. You haven't even told me any notions. You just said universal human concerns. So now you're using a synonym for human concerns in notions. You still haven't said any specific idea. So have a look at this second sentence. These notions are evidenced in the textual conversations. It would just be one conversation, I would say, at a high level, between Shakespeare's play The Tempest, okay, this is where you're introducing the text, and Margaret Atwood's prose fiction novel Hagseed. The crazy thing was this second sentence didn't say anything else. It literally just said these notions. And remember, you haven't actually said any notions. All you had said was human concerns, and you haven't said what they are. You haven't said what they are. And now you're saying these things that we don't know what they are evidenced. Well, you haven't told me anything, so I have no idea what you mean by that. But you haven't even gone beyond introducing the text in this sentence. You should never have a sentence that purely or merely introduces the text. You need to introduce the text while extending your introduction of the analysis, right? So you have to have more. You have to introduce the key ideas. You have to introduce how it's an adapted version or how it has a layered commentary. Your first two sentences have to hit the crux of the question, and you haven't mentioned once the layered commentary. So in terms of how you're answering the question so far, it's at a really low level because you just aren't showing the words, if nothing else. So again, I'll put adapted here. I've added adapted in blue. I've added appropriate here to help you better answer the question. But in terms of the sophistication of the ideas, we're not seeing that either because you're not being specific about what the notions are. A notion, an idea. Avoid all of that kind of language. Avoid it. Just be specific, okay? Don't say these notions. Let's say something specific. So first of all, so we're going to address those two things here. How do we actually make sure we're responding directly to the question? And how do we do that specifically? And how do we avoid being too generic with these notions, okay? Funnily enough, your sentence 3 and 4 actually goes into a lot of specific detail, so we might end up just drawing from that. And in fact, I might use that to do this better version. But for the meantime, how do you answer the question better here? First of all, you could have said, our evidence in the textual conversation between Shakespeare's play, you've got to make it clear that Atwood is providing the layered commentary, right? So, and Margaret Atwood's layered, now it's a metatextually layered. This is key. See how where we're responding to the question of layered, I'm going to say her metatextually layered commentary in her novelized adaptation, Hagseed. Now here I get metatextually layered. When you use the word of the question, try and say something specific next to it. Try and add an adjective or something after it that expands. You've got to have the bit that expands. See how it says layered? The question said layered. But see how this one says metatextually layered? That's where you're getting the marks because now you're going beyond the question and saying something specific. So try and look for adjectives and words that you can add before and after the keyword of the question to expand and go beyond merely restating the words of the question. That's the trick. So these notions are evidenced in the textual conversation between Shakespeare's play The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's metatextually layered commentary in her novelized adaptation Hagseed. Now, again, it's quite a wordy sentence because there's so many big words in there introducing the text. But let's just say in Shakespeare's, in the textual conversation, let's get rid of this because it just doesn't add anything. And we can go into the specific notions at the end of the sentence. In the textual conversation between Shakespeare's play The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's metatextually layered commentary. Now it's starting to be a bit clunky, isn't it? And Margaret Atwood's metatextually layered commentary in. See, that gets a bit complex. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the metatextually layered commentary and I'm going to move it after. So, and often this happens, right? When you're editing, you have to play around with the sentence. Don't be afraid to change it, chop and change. That's what the best students do. They'll keep rereading through it and trying different versions to make it flow better. And you always reread it out loud. So in the textual conversation between Shakespeare's play The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's novelized adaptation Hagseed, now I changed it from novel to novelized adaptation because the keyword of the question was adaptation. So any way of getting that in there and being specific, like here we're saying the type. So actually in purple, I'll put the type, the novelized adaptation, the metatextually layered. See how we're going beyond just repeating the question? So the first thing is you have to mention the keywords of the question. The second thing is you have to expand on the keywords. They're kind of the two goals in terms of responding to the question effectively, which is one of the three criteria here. So in the textual conversation between Shakespeare's play The Tempest and Margaret Atwood's novelized adaptation Hagseed, Atwood provides a metatextually layered commentary. Right now we can say what of or to, like why is she doing that? It does say how does she provide it, right? Atwood provides a metatextually layered commentary. This is where I'd like to see some explanation of what actually happens. How is it layered, right? By leveraging the play itself. This is going to be good. So by leveraging the play itself, by using the play itself as a pedagogical tool, look at that suggestion already, or a pedagogical vehicle, leveraging the play itself as a pedagogical vehicle for social reform, right? By leveraging the play itself, it provides a metatextually layered commentary by leveraging the play itself as a pedagogical vehicle for social reform. So she wants to push a social agenda. That's the appropriation point of view. But she's using the play itself. She's providing a layered commentary to do so. And pedagogical means to teach. So it's got this teaching property because Felix is teaching the inmates. And in doing so, that's like Margaret Atwood, who wrote the book, who wrote the novel. That's like Atwood teaching us, the reader. And that also, in effect, transforms our understanding of the play. And you could work that in here, but I think it's best to just work that in after. So sentences 3 and 4 by this student, by Jake, are interesting because they really level up. The first two sentences, not so good. Although structurally, it's correct. So structurally correct, but in substance, it didn't have enough specificity. And you kind of wasted the second sentence just introducing the text, where you should have added something else that linked back to the keywords of the question. Sentence number 3, Shakespeare's Jacobean religious outlook. So great specific contextual link there. Now we're getting into specificity. Don't wait until sentence 3 to start getting specific, okay? You've got to be specific in different ways. Like we don't want to bring this in the first sentence necessarily because we're not introducing the text. But you could have been specific about one of the concepts or the overall struggle or something like that ties in. So Be specific in the way that is relevant to the sentence you're writing. In this case, because we're bringing in context, be specific about that. Jacobean religious outlook examines the power of introspection as a vehicle for religious redemption. It's funny, I didn't know if you meant to say that it really was introspection, that, Prospero is very introspective. Perhaps he is. I don't know. I'd be interested to see how you argue that throughout, because obviously in Hagseed, Felix, we see this Felix's psyche and his introspection play out a lot more, I believe, because it's framed from his perspective. It's third person limited narration, and it's a stream of consciousness style in the novel. When you have a stream of consciousness style, you're able to really see the character's thoughts play out. And we know how introspective, meaning looking within, how reflective Felix is, all of the guilt that manifests, all of the doubt that projects, right? And also his internal motivations. We don't see that introspection as much in the play because it is a play and it's harder to actually reveal that. So I wasn't sure, did you mean the power of introspection or supernatural intervention or something else? I understand the religious outlook as a vehicle for religious redemption, but I first of all, I didn't think introspection was necessarily the right term when you're comparing the two texts for the reasons I just stated. And secondly, it's not clear what you're saying. You're saying religious outlook, religious redemption. So you don't want to double up on words like that. So make sure you always read through and be very clear. Did you want to say spiritual redemption? I wasn't exactly sure, but obviously avoid doubling up on the same words just from a sophistication point of view. So let's say you meant to say religious outlook examines the power of, if you said supernatural intervention as a vehicle for spiritual redemption. Yes, that's quite wordy, but I'm just going to put it in as an example. I'd have to see your argument to know exactly what would work here, but let's just say this was more appropriate. And then you need to have a comma. We need to be careful. And we say, whereas, so you have comma, whereas, this is the comparison. Whereas Atwood reconstructs this role. I understand why you might have had, okay, so you want to say they're both introspective, but the introspection for Prospero is all about religious or spiritual redemption, whereas introspection for Felix is more about self-liberation. It's an interesting take. Again, I don't know if I fully agree with it, but if you can argue it, you can stick with it, as long as you can prove it in your evidence. Or I might agree with it, but I just don't know if it's the main thing I would focus on. Whereas Atwood reconstructs this role through her postmodernist secular lens. Now, this is much better specificity in terms of the context. So again, looking at the bits that I'm underlining now, that's good specific context for an introduction. That's a big tick. You say as a mechanism for self-liberation. That's good. That's really specific. It's kind of like a bundle of words there. I don't know if it all connects, but self-liberation in a more secular sense makes sense. Spiritual redemption is different. Yeah, again, a lot of this would tie to what you actually argue. So I'm happy with how specific you've been there. I would just question whether you really want to focus on the introspection as the main thing you're comparing, or do you want to compare how they're able to be liberated in the sense that one is triggered by a revenge quest and the other one is more by, as you know, with Felix in Hagseed, it's not really about revenge, but it's about letting go of his guilt, right? So self-forgiveness versus the forgiveness of others. That would be a good comparison. Like how the power of forgiveness towards others, or a religiously motivated forgiveness, how that is a tool for empowerment or for redemption in the play. And then you talk about how in Hagseed, it's more about self-forgiveness, and it's more through a psychological frame that we're able to understand that. So it's less religious. There's still some kind of supernatural allusions in the novel, but I would focus more on kind of, self-liberation. I understand self-forgiveness, but I think there's a liberation in both texts. It's just achieved through different modes, and it comes from different places. One person is trying to kind of resurrect their dead daughter, right? That's what Felix is trying to do, bring his daughter back to life. So there's a different psychological and emotional agenda there. right? He's trying to bring his daughter back to life through the performance of the play. And in doing so, he's trying to preserve his connection with his daughter, keep her alive, right? So that's a different motivation to wanting to get revenge against others and kind of preserve control through magic of an island, okay, and including control over his daughter. So think about that. I know that's a lot to take in what I just said, but what I'm trying to get you to do is probe a little bit more deeply into what the true distinction is between the texts. Is it really about introspection being the same and the liberation bit being different? Or is it about how and why they get to the point of liberation? Because you could argue they both achieve a kind of liberation, but who is liberated is different for sure. Like in the novel, you also kind of get the liberation of the inmates as well through their education. So there's a lot of things to consider there. Focus in on the couple that are going to resonate with you, but I would think maybe rethink the focus that you've currently got. This is like your most important sentence at this point. And then lastly, through her ficto-criticism, interesting, like a fiction that is basically looking back at another text. It's a good term for what Hagseed is. Atwood condemns oppressive social archetypes and empowers the marginalized within an egalitarian framework, diverging from Shakespeare's colonialist dynamics by rejecting moral binaries and extending the cultural discourse initiated by Shakespeare. You probably don't need to actually extend that. What I would say is, wow, that's a really good sentence, extremely sophisticated. And it's weird to look back at this. It's like you've gone from, beginner, very beginner, to better, like pretty advanced, to, okay, now you're excelling. Like if every sentence was at this quality, you would be getting top marks. So the quality improves so much. Unfortunately, you would be better off having this quality as your first sentence and making a really good impression. But this is right down at the bottom. And I can't see too much linkage to the question. So the answering the question part is still not even satisfied here. So whilst this is really sophisticated and it's really specific about the text and the context and the change, it still could be better at adapting or addressing this question. So how could we make a few tweaks here? Atwood condemn through her ficto-criticism. Well, first of all, you say ficto-criticism, but can't you just weave in the adaptation or appropriation part? Like through her, you could say lay it again, but we don't want to just repeat that for the sake of it. But you could say through her ficto-critical adaptation or appropriation. So instead of saying criticism, you could say ficto-critical adaptation. And I know that's just playing around, that's just being creative with the language there, but that is going to help you address the question, use the terms of the question. And it actually uses what you already had to provide a specific expansion on the question. So it's kind of like a double whammy. Atwood condemns oppressive social archetypes and empowers the marginalized within an egalitarian framework. See, you say diverging from, I would say appropriating Shakespeare's colonialists. So instead of diverging from, appropriating, because she's appropriating those, she's making them her own. That's what appropriating means. You're using it for your own purpose. You're appropriating Shakespeare's colonialist dynamics by rejecting moral binaries and extending the cultural discourse. Okay, so extending, couldn't you say layering and add in, you could say by rejecting moral binaries and add in a progressive layer, add in a progressive layer to the cultural discourse. That's nice. But see how that's going to really get you marks with the answering the question part, because you're actually saying what type of layer it is. It's a progressive layer because you've said it's an egalitarian framework, which means it's more about equality. They're the values of contemporary society. So adding a progressive layer hits the question perfectly, and it allows you to preserve all of the great stuff that you had there. So hopefully that is all making sense. I know this is very detailed. I'm probably rambling on certain points and you just want me to move on, but let's give this a final grade. So if I'm thinking about the original, okay, if I'm thinking about the original, not the changes, remember the start and even the end didn't really hit the question. So if this was the essay question, I don't think the response was nearly up to scratch in terms of addressing those specific terms. You need to use the terms a lot more. So have a look at all the blue parts. I think all of the ones in blue I've added. They weren't there in the first place. So you need to be a lot more deliberate about engaging with those words. You'll notice it doesn't mean that you have to change the whole sentence. You just have to be strategic and deliberate about where you slot it in. Be thoughtful about it, and you'll find that you can probably just put it in very easily. Instead of saying the newer text, say the adapted text. And sorry, I realized saying adapted was actually wrong at the start. The adapted text is the original one. This would actually be the adapted text. So apologies for that. As an adaptation, yeah, okay. So I would put adaptation versus newer text. So yeah, as a modern adaptation converses with, right? So yeah, apologies for any confusion before with that one. Have a look at all the blue, and then that's how you can link directly with the question. Remember to add in these purple parts. You probably already have the expansions there. Like this was already expanding. You know, if we say progressive layer, the progressive part is the expansion. You want to always be adding something beyond the question. Okay, so in terms of how it was answering the question to begin with, honestly, it was pretty low down. You still had a lot of synonyms and you were still speaking to the question, like you were responding to it, but just not directly enough. So it'd be like a low B. It's not like a D or a C just because you didn't mention the words, but it just wasn't clear at all that you were explicitly or clearly responding to this question. You didn't talk about the layered commentary at all. So in fact, it probably is a C. You know, if we're doing an A to E scale, that would be a C, because you still have talked about the difference between the texts, but I've had to go kind of searching for how you've responded to it. You didn't make it clear to begin with, and you didn't explicitly address the layered commentary aspect at all. So, and that's the key word. So that you'd be heavily penalized for that. In terms of textual engagement, it got better. Like it got so good by the end that you were at a high A level. But the first two sentences, because they were so vague and they said nothing specific about the text, the first sentence didn't need to, but it could have drawn upon a concept. The second sentence was wasted. The third one was really good, and the fourth was great. I put it at a B level there because of where it got to. Won't penalize you as heavily for the first sentence because I know you wanted that to be vague. And then in terms of the sophistication, it got so sophisticated by the end, I was really impressed. But the first two sentences were the complete opposite. So again, it kind of balances out probably to like a B minus. I'm going to do B minus because the last two sentences were so good that you're still overall in that B range, right? Band 5, band 5, band 4. Oddly enough, you know, if you just read the last two sentences, almost if you just removed the second sentence entirely, you would be close to an A, but it kind of detracted because of how generic it was. So I put that as a B as well. You're on the verge of like a low band 6 or a low A, because the other sentences were quite redemptive. So, you know, I'm going to put it as an A minus. Okay, you can get there, just a few easy tweaks to the first couple of sentences. So that's where it is. Overall, it's a solid B. You know, solid band 5. This could easily be a high band 6 if we fix up the first couple of sentences, and if we answer the question a lot more clearly. It's got all the ingredients there. Just needs a lot more of a thoughtful effort at answering the question. All right, so let me know if you have any questions in the comments. That is a breakdown of the first one. I've got another one that I can look at. Let me know if you'd want me to go through another example. Hello, Imperator. Good to see you in the comments. But yeah, let me know in the chat if you have any questions. Otherwise, let me have a look at what else I've got here. I've got Oscar's response from the castle. I'll go through this one a lot more quickly. How does your study of the castle inform your understanding of how language shapes identity? Discuss this with reference to your prescribed text. Okay, so how does your study of the castle inform your understanding of how does language shape identity? Okay. So language and identity are key here. How does language shape identity from the castle? Let's have a look at how Oscar has answered this. Now, first of all, the body paragraph Oscar has provided, because we're not looking at an introduction here, we're looking at a body paragraph, is over 250 words. Now, that's really long for a body paragraph, especially for English Standard. So whilst I like the level of depth, I can see here, if everyone's looking at this is like having 3 topic sentences, essentially. I've highlighted all of this because this is all essentially introducing the key ideas as far as I can see. So yeah, like the last sentence is a little bit more analytical, a little bit more specific. But if you read the first 2, you've basically got 2 topic sentences, and 2 topic sentences can be really sophisticated, right? So you actually lead with a concept, don't even bring in the text. While Australia is often perceived as an egalitarian society, this self-fashioned ethos is disrupted when cultural assumptions clash with systemic inequalities. That's a fantastic topic sentence. That is a fantastic topic sentence. It presents the complexity so well. It uses the word while or whilst, right, to establish that you're going to present a complexity. Whilst Australia is often perceived as an egalitarian society, this self-fashioned ethos is disrupted when cultural assumptions clash with systemic inequalities. It's actually brilliant. I've got nothing to say on that other than it doesn't answer the question. So the sophistication of it, it's all perfect, except it doesn't actually respond to this question specifically. So if you could make the subtle changes there, I mean, you say self-fashioned ethos. A self-fashioned ethos is a self-fashioned identity, isn't it? Like, you really only have to change that much to get the direct linkage with the question, which is just going to make it easy for the market to be like, that's perfect. Because right now I read that, I'm like, wow, that is really good. Really, really good. But you didn't link it to the question, right? You say ethos, and yes, ethos is a synonym for identity. So I have no doubt you'd still kind of be getting a band 6 or a top mark for that one. But I just think make it easier for yourself by choosing to engage with the actual words of the question when you can, because you say it's a self-fashioned identity. You've already expanded on it with what you have here. So I would just make that very small change. And then insofar as the language is concerned, you haven't addressed it in the first couple of sentences either. So you do say language down here. I just think it's all coming in too late. And my first point, of course, was that this is all too much to get into it before going into all of your analysis. So you take too long to get into the analysis. Definitely at least one sentence too many here. So try to either merge these sentences or merge these sentences. So bring in your first specific example in tandem with some of these broader comments that you make here. So try and weave them, weave what you have here into your specific examples here, because this is just too much and you might want to just cut one of these sentences out altogether for the sake of the word count. But yeah, I would bring in language earlier as well. I think that's just coming in too late. I'd want it in the first 2 sentences. If you can even get it in the first. I mean, while Australia is often perceived, this self-fashioned identity is disrupted when cultural assumptions clash with systemic inequalities. It kind of flows so nicely that I don't even want to mess with it. But if you wanted to get language in there, when cultural assumptions clash with systemic inequalities. Let's see if we can get in the second sentence, because I don't really want to tweak that too much. Because again, I'm emphasizing that that's a really good example. As individuals confront the dissonance between idealized equality and entrenched social stratification, this is highly sophisticated, and it's not the standard expected for like a standard one. This is definitely advanced. As individuals confront the dissonance between idealized equality and entrenched social stratification, they are compelled to redefine their identity in response to this reckoning. Yeah, by this point, we need to have language. you're actually repeating yourself there. That's the thing. If you read your first sentence, you say there's a clash between, being a fair society and having inequality. You're actually saying in idealized equality, that's the egalitarian society, and social stratification, which is the inequality. So this bit is actually repeating what you've already just said. So there we go. That makes it easy. Look for repetition. Let's get to the next point. You don't have time to waste. They are compelled to redefine their identity in response to this reckoning. Okay, so I feel like, I don't know if you're giving me all of your topic sentences here now that I look at this, because almost this feels like the next point. Wouldn't this be the next paragraph, that individuals as a consequence of this are compelled to redefine? Or this might be a very specific point that you make within the paragraph. So I would, very easily, just going through this, I would either use this as a separate point and paragraph, or as a subpoint within the paragraph, i.e. as the kind of ultimate consequence of this clash. So perhaps the last piece of evidence. That's how I would go about that. And then that helps you get rid of that. This illusion of Australian egalitarianism is satirically deconstructed in the castle. Yeah, this feels like the second sentence. So there we go. This second one doesn't belong there. That bit can go elsewhere. You don't need that, and we've solved the problem. Now you have a fantastic two-sentence opener that mentions both identity and language. So this illusion of egalitarianism is satirically deconstructed. You probably don't even need to say of Australian egalitarianism, because again, you've just said that here. You could say of something else if you wanted to fill that gap, or you just get rid of that. This illusion, I know that'll feel a bit empty if we do that. I'll leave it for now. You can have a think about how you could maybe reword this one. Is satirically deconstructed in the castle as Daryl's Aussie battler persona is challenged by the exclusionary legal discourse of corporate elites, revealing the commodification of the human experience and language's complicity in sustaining systemic power. Excellent, excellent. This is a near perfect start to a paragraph. Very sophisticated. It uses the words of the question, and it's engaged in the deeper themes of the text. So huge props to Oscar. I think it was Oscar. Oscar, you've nailed this one. Fantastic example for anyone else who's lucky enough to see it. That is a fantastic two-sentence starter to a paragraph, where you break up the concept with a nice kind of flary, sophisticated, flowy sentence that really breaks down the complexity, followed by how is this actually represented in the text specifically, and then you've drawn on that. So great work, Oscar, on that introduction to the paragraph. Where you kind of come unstuck a little bit is just in the repetition of your actual analysis. It's like the sophistication goes down because you repeat your evidence introductions every time. So try and mix up your sentence starters and try and weave in your quotes a little bit better. Because you can see here you go, Daryl's colloquial truncation, comma, tell him he's dreaming. If you could reword that so that you don't have to pause after saying the truncation bit, so add in a few words here or there so that the quote flows in like a normal sentence, that will elevate your sophistication. Giving us a little bit of context just before you get into the technique would actually help as well. It feels a little bit abrupt here, abrupt start. Can you add in one clause setting the scene here? Like as this happens, comma, as, comma, Daryl's colloquial truncation, right? So yeah, try and create a bit more of a less abrupt start there. And then avoid just going, Daryl's this, Daryl's this. You need to mix up those sentence starters, and having these little contextual sentence starters will help, but you can also have things like moreover or however. So you say, tell him he's dreaming, humorously asserts his belief in a fair go. See how you say humorously asserts his belief in a fair go? See how I didn't need to pause to say that quote? That's what you want to do up here. That's what you ideally want to do with every quote. You might not be able to do it every time, but do it as much as possible. And it takes a bit of thinking sometimes to get the structure right. But everyone should notice this. When the sentence here says, humorously asserts his belief in a fair go, the fact that I don't have to pause before saying fair go, which is enabled by the concision of the quote. It's only 2 words. Fantastic. Use as many 2-word, 1-word quotes as possible. Weave them into the sentence. That's going to elevate your sophistication. Notice as well that what Oscar's done is he's used multiple quotes within the sentence, and they're often short quotes. Amazing. He says his belief in a fair go, yet ironically emphasizes that Daryl himself is dreaming, right? He's actually bringing in the specific parts of the original quote to really break it down. So this is an awesome example to go through, actually. By believing in an egalitarian legal system that does not truly exist, instead serving those in power. Okay. So a bit more context needed there, but otherwise great. Daryl's immutable credence that a man's home. See how you say Daryl's immutable credence that a man's home is his castle. See, Oscar's added that, which allows him to flow into the quote. We don't have to pause. We don't have to have a comma. Excellent. So that's an example of how you can do it with a simple word like that. Daryl's immutable credence that a man's home is his castle reflects the emotional embodiment of Australia's egalitarian myth, which is derived from Sir Edward Coke's interpretation of the Magna Carta. That feels a bit random there, to be honest. It's a good contextual note. It just feels like it comes out of nowhere, which is derived from this. Okay, so it's like a bit of history, a bit of an added note, like, hey, this credence comes from this Magna Carta. There's not a super clear connection otherwise of relevance. It's like, here's a fun fact, is how this reads. Fun fact, this comes from this. It doesn't speak directly to the context in the sense that it was responding to something at the time. You're just giving us an additional fun fact of history. That's how it sounds. So what's the relevance of this is the question. Make it a little bit more, make it sound more consequential. Like, so what that it's from that interpretation? Why is the Magna Carta important? So what? So that's what I would ask to that part, but well done on the flow. It's just the sentence starter again. It's just a little bit kind of repetitive, especially when you look at the third one. Daryl's argument, Daryl's credence that. Daryl's argument that the law is supposed to be about that. So it gets a little bit predictable, losing a bit of sophistication by doing that. So yeah, you need to pick between words like moreover, however. It's going to be dependent on what you're actually saying, of course. But try and use words like this. You might have other ones like consequently. And try and avoid repeating the same points. Because here you say this power imbalance is also echoed. That makes me think you're just going to repeat yourself. Repeating the same point. If you're repeating the same point, get rid of it. Use a different piece, use a different example that's going to allow you to say something more advanced. Like this is where you could bring in the point about how people have to redefine their identity as a consequence. Okay, that's interesting. So make sure that every example presents a new point that builds on the previous point. If you're just going to avoid using is also echoed. I mean, it's almost a double up there. Echoed and also are 2 words that are concerning because both of those words imply that you're going to repeat the same point. So consider whether you even need this. Best to make sure every point is adding a new insight that builds from the previous one. Okay, and then you have the last sentence, through the allegory of the game. This again feels a bit random. Is this the link sentence? Daryl is metaphorically positioned as a powerless player, revealing that justice is unattainable and thus impossible in a system where language is controlled and manipulated by those in power. Okay, so you brought language back there. You did say humorously. You have talked about language, but maybe you could have made that clearer throughout. So I would use more words of the question throughout there. So identity and language. I'm looking back and I'm thinking, could you have used identity and language a little bit more? Yes. So go back through and find out where you could do that. Otherwise, the sophistication is really high. The evidence as well is really high. it's probably not an A+ because of those the repetition and the predictability of the sentence starters with Daryl's, and then having a repeated point there. So that probably takes it to maybe actually to an A-. The evidence itself that you've picked seems to be really good, so I'd put that as an A. You know what? The topic sentences were so good, and the way you've weaved in the quotes are so good, I'm going to give that an A as well. Answering the question just did lack a little bit. Again, missed an easy opportunity there. You still had a synonym, so you still get the marks. But throughout your actual evidence, try and make a more conscious effort to weave in the words of the question, because we didn't see identity in language said enough. So I put it an A-. But overall, fantastic response, definitely in the band 6 category for this module. So well done. Conceptually, it's really impressive, and that always puts you in a good spot to get, you know, a very high mark in the 90s overall. So I hope that helps everyone. Well done on that, Oscar. Very impressive. Let's see. So we got Stan here. You're literally my cheat code. Great to know. Thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Is it possible to say that Shakespeare subtly critiques how colonial masters permanently stigmatize the indigenous population to suggest their racial inferiority and enslave them? Yes, it is possible to say that. Certainly at the time, if you're talking about The Tempest, and you're wanting to say that Shakespeare, it is subtle because he's more projecting the ambivalence of the time. He's not presenting a super critical perspective. He's just showing how it was and what the potential sides of the argument were. He's not saying that Prospero is necessarily completely evil and tyrannical, but certainly especially after we've read Hagseed, we would tend to look back and see it that way. And that's the reframing that happens. We start to understand the text differently because we are imposing or superimposing our own values on top of a previous text that belongs to a different era with different values. So it's a little bit like anachronistic. But yes, certainly looking back, we can see that there is this stigmatization. Shakespeare was more subtle. This is a really good point you could make. Shakespeare was more subtle in commenting on this stigmatization of indigenous populations or the native peoples of the lands that were colonized during the Age of Discovery. And then Atwood makes it far more explicit with her more overt commentary on social reform in this area, about not stigmatizing individuals and confining them to specific identities and allowing us to let go of the control that we have over other people, other minority groups, marginalized, to allow them to fulfill their potential in society as well. And to make sure that when people go to prison, or they are literally imprisoned, or you imprison anyone metaphorically, that you understand the dangers of stigmatizing them and how that prevents them from flourishing as individuals. And she wants us to be more rehabilitative than punitive, in the sense that insofar as prisons or imprisonment is concerned. Okay, so since Shakespeare mostly adheres to the Jacobean context, also my teacher said, once said I should be careful about saying Shakespeare critiques traditional gender norms. Yeah, again, Shakespeare is not really like a critic of things. Shakespeare typically projects. Shakespeare's plays are mirrors up to nature. He holds a mirror up to nature. That's the beauty of Shakespeare's works. He's not like super opinionated in a funny way, right? He's a master of projecting society at the time. Yes, he has certain biases because of his audience. Often, remember, Shakespeare was performing for the king or queen, but he didn't shy away from alluding to conflicting perspectives, perspectives that might not have been fully agreeable with the conventional thinking of the time. So was Shakespeare a progressive? Was he critiquing traditional gender norms? I don't know. I think maybe yes at times, but he's more projecting these attitudes of the time. And it's more subsequent texts and adaptations like Hagseed that make us look back and apply that perspective. That would be like, oh wow, I see the subversive gender norms at the time. But again, Shakespeare's just projecting how it was, rather than critiquing. I would say he's more again projecting, representing, mirroring. That would be the language I'd be more using. So I understand what your teacher's saying there. For my module B, I'm doing good night and good luck. Any particular tips? Well, good night and good luck. Great text. I mean, obviously that's a real interrogation of truth, especially in the context of political deceit and subterfuge, where there is a lot of manipulation going on with how things are presented in the media, how surveillance is conducted. I would look closely at the context and understand how the truth was being perverted at the time. When you look at good night and good luck, you've got to consider Senator McCarthy. You've got to consider the anti-communist sentiment there and the hypocrisies of the American government. So if you can consider those contextual nuances, especially to do with how the American government was manipulating the truth and turning people against each other, even though they apparently were defending our civil freedoms, they were defending democracy, and yet they were depriving us of the ability to think freely, and they were surveilling everyone and making sure everyone thought the same way. And they exploited fear as a tactic to ensure compliance with the government to protect their own power. I think if you can really delve deeply into that context of the time, the anti-communist hysteria, the idea that the government was being hypocritical, probe into that, and you'll have a much more sophisticated analysis. Also, if you ignore the form, you're going to come unstuck pretty easily. So if you can have at least 2 specific references to the form of the text, so think about the way that it's filmed, any meta-cinematic elements, the color schemes, the lighting, it's so prominent there, isn't it? A lot of chiaroscuro lighting with the darkness and the shades, all of those things, the way that there are frames within frames very often, certain static shots, all of that's important for helping represent these ideas about truth and deceit and manipulation. So form and context are going to be the key ways for you to stand out. Make sure you understand and articulate that understanding of specific elements of the context and form in every single paragraph. I would aim for 2 references to form and context per paragraph to truly elevate your response above others. My mod C task is in 4 weeks. For all of my responses, should I refer to 2 of my prescribed texts? For module C, the craft of writing, I only would base my draft response off 1 prescribed text. 1 prescribed text, unless your teacher has indicated otherwise. Look at 1 prescribed text, absorb or rather study up on how they've used at least 2 stylistic features, like first person narration style. Maybe it's unreliable and that's important. Maybe they've used an extended metaphor or an anecdote at the beginning. Pick 2 of those features at least. I would focus on 2. Use them in your own work. Make sure you write about something similar but not the same as the ideas or concerns explored in your prescribed text. So in that 1 prescribed text, take out at least 2 stylistic elements like an anecdote, extended metaphor, first person narration. Use those in your own work for your own purposes, but make sure that you explore an idea or concern that is at least related to the prescribed text as well. Because, why do I say that? Because you could get a question that asks you to do something relating to the characters or perspectives presented in the prescribed text. So you need to have that connection both in form and in themes, in substance and in form. So that's really important. Make sure that you, first of all, draft an extended piece. If you already know you have to do a reflection, it's different, but I would draft an extended piece in your preferred form, like a discursive, an imaginative, or a persuasive. And from there, come up with your adapted versions into the other forms, but make sure you're talking about the same thing and preserve as much as you can. If you do a discursive, the persuasive will be very similar, When you do your persuasive version, it will be very similar, but the tone will be different. You're presenting a more firm argument and trying to convince the audience of something, whereas in the discursive, it's less definitive in its tone and it's more contemplative. You're sharing ideas. The other one, you're actually trying to spread an idea and convince the reader to agree with your perspective. But you're still going to talk about all the same stuff. You'll be able to preserve a lot of the content, but you should practice tweaking the tone and adding in some more rhetorical devices, rhetorical questions, logos, ethos, pathos, appealing to the responder, saying have you ever felt like this, etc. So though, and a lot of repetition can be useful as well. Not too much, but just repeated phrases for emphasis, isolated sentences, things like that to become more persuasive. That would be how you go from a discursive to a persuasive, and then you'd have to have the imaginative version as well. So you do have to prepare a lot, prepare as early as possible. So if it's in 4 weeks, start now with your base draft, and then also, of course, have a reflection that focuses on how you've used at least 2 of those stylistic features, 1 per paragraph, how you've used it based on how the prescribed text used it, and compare how you used it and they used it, and talk about why you used it. What markers are looking for in a Module C reflection is an understanding of purpose. Why did you use that technique? Why did you use an anecdote? What did it achieve for you? Yes, provide an example, but focus on what it achieved in relation to the audience. What was your intended impact on the audience in terms of bringing them into your piece or helping achieve your purpose, helping persuade, helping share something with the reader? For my Module C 8 marker reflection, would you talk about both macro and micro? Yes, I would, but I would focus it around the macro. So 2 macro features, 1 macro feature per body paragraph that is connected to 2 features from the prescribed text that you've drawn from. And then the micro features should come in within that paragraph, within that analysis, but base it on the macro feature, each paragraph, and you should have 2 of those. And then you might have a short introduction, sentence or 2, and maybe a 1-sentence conclusion. But with an 8 marker, you mainly want to focus on those 2 paragraphs, 1 macro feature in each one, like an anecdote, like an extended metaphor, like the narration style. So once you have that, you then bring in examples of how you've used it. But within those examples, within those quotes, you can also integrate some analysis of the micro technique. So when you're talking about the anecdote, maybe you also used visual image, imagery, just to be really simple, or a metaphor or a simile or personification. So within your examples of the macro feature, you might also try to weave in or find an example of a micro feature that pairs with it. So find a pairing between a specific technique that happens to occur within an example of the macro technique. So I hope that makes sense. It's macro focused, but you tie in the micro maybe once or twice in the examples within the paragraph, just to elevate the level of sophistication. All right, hope that makes sense. Hi, Shabad, good to see you again as well. Look, I'm gonna have to wrap up here, guys, but appreciate you jumping in. Thanks for the questions. Hope the analysis of the student submissions helped. Got through 2 of them, which I'm happy about. So now you've got an introduction to look at. You can rewatch this back, of course, and the body paragraph as well. So there's some really good examples there of a breakdown of what's good, what could be better. So have a look at those examples. If you want to submit your own work for feedback, make sure you use the link underneath these videos on YouTube. If you haven't already, do me a favor and subscribe, please. And if you want to check out our resources, Jeddle.com has all of our tech-specific resources, access to JeddAI for access to our team of experts if you want drafts to get marked. So if you have drafts that you want to get feedback on, then subscribe to JeddAI. Otherwise, you can sign up to access all of our resources at Jeddle.com. So please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Appreciate you guys all joining. Sorry, I pulled up another question there. Okay, Shabad, fantastic. So Shabad, you bought a Jeddle subscription. Great review. Thank you for saying it's great. Glad you're enjoying it. For anyone else, make sure you jump on to Jeddle.com to get access to that. Otherwise, thank you so much. I'll see you guys next week. If you have specific questions, come prepared and we can break down any assessment questions you have, can give you advice on all of that. Otherwise, thanks so much for tuning in and see you next time.